May 1945. The Third Reich collapses, and Germany falls into a void. The bombs have stopped, but the silence that follows is heavier than the ruins themselves. Across streets reduced to skeletons of brick and ash, one figure becomes impossible to ignore. German women alone, exhausted, and standing at the edge of a world that no longer resembles anything they once knew. Their roles have shattered. Their families have scattered. Their country has ceased to exist. And in that vacuum, between hunger, fear, and the arrival of foreign soldiers, they face choices no one had ever prepared them for. Choices that blur survival, dignity, and unexpected human connections, including the forbidden relationships with American soldiers after the war. This is not a story about guilt or victory. It is a story about human beings after the fall. War Brides. The untold lives of German women after Hitler's defeat begins now, the final breath of a dying empire. Berlin, April 1945. Smoke drifts across a sky the color of cold steel. Entire neighborhoods lie broken, their walls peeled open like books, burned by time. The ground trembles in the distance as Soviet artillery closes in, shaking the last foundations of a regime already gasping for air. Inside this collapsing world, women move through the rubble with a quiet determination that defies the chaos around them. For 6 years, Nazi propaganda had celebrated them as the heart of the home. The ones who waited, who sacrificed, who endured. But now, with the army destroyed and millions of men dead or missing, the truth is impossible to ignore. They are the last ones left standing. Not because they chose it, but because there is no one else. Many husbands lie in frozen graves outside Stalingrad. Many sons never returned from the beaches of Normandy. Many fathers vanished into the white silence of the Eastern Front. And now, as the Reich crumbles, Germany turns silently, desperately, to the people it once relegated to the background. Its women. What they faced after the 8th of May, 1945. On the 8th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But for millions of women, this was not the end of suffering, it was the beginning of a terrifying new chapter. When the gunfire faded, the silence revealed something far more brutal. Starvation, lawlessness, displacement, fear. The post-war months were a world without rules, without structure, without protection. A place where everyone struggled to survive the next sunrise. A country drained to the bone. In the immediate aftermath, millions of homes were destroyed. More than 7 million Germans were dead. Millions of refugees flooded in from the east. Food production collapsed. Transport networks were crippled. Winter approached with almost no fuel. Daily rations often fell to 1,200 calories or less, not enough for an adult to maintain basic health. This period became known as the Hunger Years, but the burden fell most heavily on women, who were left to feed their children, rebuild their homes, and protect themselves at a time when the future felt like an empty page written in cold ink. Trümmerfrauen, the women who rebuilt Germany by hand. If one image defines post-war Germany, it is the sight of women standing on mountains of rubble, passing bricks hand to hand in silent rhythm. They were called Trümmerfrauen, the women of the ruins. There were no machines, no cranes, no organized system. Only baskets, gloves worn thin, and the steady persistence of human hands. They cleared entire streets. They salvaged bricks, washed them, stacked them. They built temporary shelters and reopened schools in rooms with no windows. And they did all of this while starving, while caring for children, while mourning losses they had not yet fully understood. It was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was survival, slow, grinding, relentless. Yet decades later, Germany would look back at them as the silent architects of its rebirth. The arrival of American soldiers. As the dust settled, The occupying powers moved in. The Americans took control of the Southwest, bringing with them a world that felt impossibly foreign to the defeated nation. Well-fed, confident, and carrying supplies the average German had not seen in years, American soldiers seemed almost unreal. Shiny boots, clean uniforms, fresh cigarettes, chocolate bars, canned meat, coffee. To a population living on thin soup and stale bread, the contrast was overwhelming. But the Americans were not just symbols of abundance. They were also symbols of power. And from the very first day, one rule was made crystal clear. American soldiers were forbidden to fraternize with Germans. No friendship, no gifts, no romantic involvement, no contact beyond strict military necessity. The Germans were still considered the enemy, even after surrender. But human nature is rarely obedient to policy. And hunger, physical and emotional bends rules faster than any order can enforce. At first, relationships formed in shadows. A chocolate bar slipped discreetly into a child's hand. A pack of cigarettes left on a doorstep. A brief conversation at a marketplace. A meeting at the edge of town after curfew. For many women, these tiny gestures were less about affection and more about sheer survival. Chocolate was calories. Cigarettes could be traded for food. Soap meant health. Coffee meant warmth. In a world stripped of dignity, these moments became lifelines. When morality meets hunger, history often avoids speaking openly about this reality, but it must be acknowledged with honesty and empathy. Many German women formed relationships with American soldiers. Some were rooted in genuine affection. Others were acts of survival, quiet negotiations in a world where everything had been taken from them. To judge them is easy. To understand them is harder. Imagine being a mother with 3 children and no income. Imagine standing in a ration line that runs out every day. Imagine facing a winter without shoes, coal, or shelter. In that landscape, ethics become a luxury. Survival becomes the only law. This was not a tale of glamour or seduction. It was a negotiation with reality, one that thousands of women had to navigate in silence. The silent shift, from enemy to protector. Ironically, the U.S. command soon realized that the no fraternization policy was hurting more than helping. Rebuilding Germany required trust, and trust required human connection. Slowly, regulations loosened. Then they disappeared entirely. Almost overnight, the streets of occupied Germany changed. American soldiers walked openly with German women. Cafes filled with whispered English and shy laughter. Markets saw the first signs of revival as goods began to circulate again. The American press called these soldiers Fräulein hunters. Germans muttered judgments under their breath. But beneath the criticism lay a more complicated truth. Many women were finding in these soldiers something Germany had not offered them for years: security, food, and sometimes, unexpectedly, kindness. The first war brides. By 1946, something new emerged. Love. Not a grand, sweeping Hollywood love, but a fragile, determined love that grew out of broken streets and shared vulnerability. Thousands of American soldiers asked German women to marry them. Many wrote letters home begging for approval. Many faced fierce resistance from their families. To Americans, marrying a German felt unthinkable. How could a boy from Ohio or Texas marry someone from Hitler's country? To Germans, it felt dangerous. How could a woman trust the soldier of the nation that defeated her own? But love, in its quiet persistence, crossed both lines. The bureaucracy was brutal. The process long. Some waited months. Some waited years. Some never reunited. And yet, a generation of war brides was born, women who left the ruins of Germany to start new lives in a country they had never seen. The women of post-war Germany were not mere witnesses of history. They were its foundation, its labor force, its emotional center, and its quiet survivors. In the ruins of a defeated nation, They faced hunger, fear, and moral dilemmas without guidance or protection. And through that darkness, they rebuilt not only their homes, but also the first fragile threads of humanity between former enemies, the quiet beginning of unlikely connections. In the summer of 1945, the air in the American occupation zone carried a strange mixture of exhaustion and possibility. Cities still smelled of smoke, the rivers carried debris, the nights echoed with the creaking silence of destruction. But in that silence, something unexpected began to take shape. A fragile, forbidden bond between conqueror and conquered. American soldiers patrolled streets lined with broken buildings and hollow-eyed civilians. But what struck them most were the women. Thin, determined, walking with quiet resilience through landscapes that looked like abandoned planets. They carried buckets for water, bundles of firewood, and the weight of families who depended entirely on them. For soldiers raised in the abundance of America, this world felt surreal. They had stepped into a defeated nation, yet the women they saw did not resemble enemies. They resembled survivors, and survival, more than anything else, is the beginning of human connection. The first interactions were barely conversations, more gestures than words. A nod, a shared look, a small, hesitant smile across the rubble, a chocolate bar left on a doorstep, a can of Spam exchanged for a bundle of flowers from a garden still stubbornly blooming. It was a kind of communication that circumvented language, built on mutual need and tentative trust. But every gesture carried risk. For the women, for the soldiers, for anyone who witnessed it. The fraternization ban was still in effect. Breaking it could mean punishment for soldiers and public shame for women. Yet the tension of the rule only intensified the magnetism of these encounters. Human closeness thrives wherever it is forbidden. And in 1945 Germany, everything was forbidden. The story of Helga, a trade of necessity. Helga Meissner was 26, with hair that once glowed gold in the sun, but now hung in muted strands around a face carved with exhaustion. Before the war, she had been a seamstress. During the war, she had been a wife. Her husband died in Italy in 1943. The notification letter came 2 months late, crumpled and cold, as if it had traveled through winter itself. By 1945, she lived with her mother and her 4-year-old daughter in what used to be a pleasant apartment in Stuttgart. Now, only one room was livable. The others were open to the sky. Every morning, Helga joined a silent caravan of women, walking toward the American barracks. They did not go to beg, they went to barter. The Americans had goods. The Germans had skills. Helga brought needlework small repairs, patches, buttons sewn back with neat precision. In return, she sought the currency of survival: canned beans, powdered milk, coffee grounds used and dried again for a second brew. The first time she met Private James Walker, he handed her a torn uniform sleeve and waited awkwardly as she mended it right there on a stoop. He watched her fingers move with practiced skill, every stitch steady despite her trembling from the cold. He offered her more than the usual ration: a bar of soap and half a tin of peaches. She hesitated. Soap was precious enough to provoke jealousy among neighbors. Peaches were mythical, but she accepted. Not because he was kind, not because he was American, but because she needed to keep her daughter alive. Over the following weeks, their exchanges grew longer. A few words of English from her, a few words of German from him. Slowly, a shared vocabulary emerged, patchwork sentences stitched together with patience. James admired her strength. Helga feared her own vulnerability. She knew what some women were doing for food. She did not judge them. She understood, but she made herself a promise. She would not trade her body, not unless everything else failed. One evening, as autumn's chill began to settle, James offered her something unexpected: a pair of children's shoes, small, sturdy, Nearly new. Helga's heart twisted. Her daughter had outgrown her last pair months ago, and now wrapped her feet in cloth. But accepting such a gift felt dangerously intimate. It crossed a line of survival and touched something deeper. "For des kind," James said softly. "For the child." Helga took the shoes. Her hands shook, and though no words were spoken, something shifted between them. Not romance, not obligation, but recognition. Two human beings, on opposite sides of a war, meeting in the fragile space between hunger and hope. The story of Ilse, a love that should not exist. Ilse Brenner was 19 when the Americans entered her town near Frankfurt. She had lost her brother in the winter offensive of 1944, and her father in an air raid. She and her mother survived in a basement, barely big enough for two. Ilse was young enough that her beauty had not been dulled by hunger, and old enough to understand the dangers that came with being noticed. She tried to blend into the ruins, but Sergeant Daniel Harris saw her within minutes of arriving. He later described it as a strange jolt, the feeling of seeing life in a place that seemed otherwise dead. Ilse, carrying a bucket of water from a broken fountain, moved with a grace that seemed to defy everything around her. Their first encounter was accidental. Daniel stepped aside to let her pass. She nodded politely, without making eye contact. The next time, he greeted her, in simple German. She paused, returned the greeting, then walked away. After a week, they were speaking briefly every day. Special rations began showing up at her door discreetly, wrapped in paper. Her mother looked at them with worry mixed with relief. "You must be careful," she whispered. "He is American." Ilse knew. That was exactly the problem. The more they spoke, the more unavoidable the truth became. They liked each other. Genuinely, unexpectedly, but affection in occupied Germany was heavier than in any other place. It carried moral weight, political implications, and the judgment of everyone around. Ilse heard the whispers. American girl. Selling herself. Traitor. None of it was true. But truth had no power in a hungry world. One evening, Daniel walked her home in the dim light of a town still without electricity. He stopped outside her building, hesitant, aware of every regulation he was breaking. "I should not be here," he admitted. "I know," she replied. "And yet, here we are." Their hands brushed. Nothing more. But in 1945 Germany, that gesture alone felt like an act that could change a life. That night, Ilse lay awake not because she was afraid of what she felt, but because she feared what the world would do to her because of it. The story of Maria, the dark trade of survival. Not every story was gentle. Not every choice was freely made. Maria Koenig was 32, with 2 sons and no husband. Her husband had been drafted in 1942 and disappeared without a trace. His last letter, filled with hope, arrived 6 months before his presumed death. Maria's home in Munich had been reduced to ashes. She lived in an abandoned cellar with her children, surviving on thin soup and the hope that tomorrow might bring food. When the Americans arrived, she saw them with a mix of fear and desperation. They had supplies. They had warmth. They had the power to keep her children alive. One night, after days without food, she made a choice she never spoke of again. She approached a soldier outside a checkpoint and asked, in broken English, for something to feed her children. He understood. He made his own offer. Her decision was not moral. It was maternal. She hated herself. But she also watched her sons eat that night for the first time in days. What Maria experienced was not uncommon. Many women were forced into situations that history rarely acknowledges. But Maria was not broken. She carried on, one day at a time, carrying a private grief deeper than the ruins she walked through. Years later, her sons would never know how she kept them alive during the darkest winter of her life. The collapse of the fraternization ban. By late 1945, it became clear to American commanders that the fraternization ban was failing. Morale was dropping. Enforcement was impossible. The humanitarian situation demanded compassion, not distance. The ban slowly dissolved, first unofficially. Then, on paper, German women began walking openly beside American soldiers. Cafes reopened and filled with tentative conversations. German children followed soldiers through the streets asking for gum, their faces lighting up at each sweet treasure. But the end of the ban did not end the stigma. Many Germans accused women involved with Americans of abandoning their country. Many Americans accused soldiers of being weak for falling for enemy women. Love, in both nations, became a battlefield of its own. The children of two worlds. As relationships deepened, a new group entered the story. Children born to American fathers and German mothers. They were nicknamed Amerikaner Kinder. Many were mixed race, especially children fathered by African American GIs. And in a still deeply prejudiced society, these children faced cruel discrimination. German neighbors whispered. American officers often refused responsibility. Bureaucracy made it nearly impossible for many fathers to bring their children to the United States. Some men fought fiercely to claim their families. Some were transferred, never to return. Some never knew. For the mothers, raising these children meant navigating a society that judged them for choices made under circumstances outsiders could not understand. Yet many of these women stood their ground. They chose love or survival, or both. They chose their children with a strength that history rarely honors. The contrast. Life in the Soviet zone. While American-German relationships grew complicated but at times tender, life for women in the Soviet zone was drastically different. The Red Army arrived as victors hardened by years of brutal warfare. They carried wounds, trauma, hunger, and rage. Many had seen their homes destroyed by German invaders. Many had lost families. Their arrival unleashed a wave of violence that left deep scars on the women of Eastern Germany, scars that lasted generations. Women survived by hiding in forests, basements, or among relatives. Some shaved their heads to appear less attractive. Some disguised themselves as elderly or sick. There were individual Soviet soldiers who helped, protected, and showed compassion. But the general atmosphere was one of fear, a stark contrast to the American zone. For many women, the difference between the two occupation forces felt like the difference between night and dawn. The relationships that emerged in the American zone were never simple. They were woven from hunger, hope, fear, affection, and the desperate need to feel human again in a world stripped of humanity. Some stories became romances whispered about decades later. Some became marriages that crossed oceans. Some became tragedies left in unmarked graves or memories too painful to speak aloud. Above all, these connections remind us that after the fall of nations, what remains are people flawed, frightened, longing, and capable of reaching for one another in the most unlikely of moments. A new Germany, trying to breathe. By 1946, the American occupation zone had shifted from chaos to an uneasy rhythm. Black markets thrived in alleyways. Children played in bomb craters as if they were ordinary playgrounds. Makeshift cafes emerged in half-destroyed buildings, serving thin coffee brewed from roasted barley. Life was beginning to move again, but slowly, like a city waking from a long coma. German women lived at the center of this awakening. They worked in clearing squads. They waited in ration lines before dawn. They stitched, traded, bartered, cleaned, repaired. But underneath the practical routines lay a more complicated battle. The emotional one. Relationships with American soldiers, once forbidden, now tolerated, were reshaping identities, loyalties, and the meaning of survival. Some women fell in love. Some sought protection. Some simply needed food. Some wanted to forget the war by holding on to someone who did not remind them of its horrors. Every story was different. Yet every story carried the same question. What does love mean in a defeated nation? Helga's crossroad. When survival turns tender. Helga Meissner had relied on Private James Walker for months. Their gestures had grown into conversations. Conversations had grown into a quiet companionship. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic embrace, only a steady familiarity. But in early 1946, James told her he was being transferred to another city. The news hit Helga with an unexpected force. Her first thought was not fear, or hunger, or loneliness. It was something far more disorienting. She did not want him to leave. She realized that James had become more than a source of canned goods and soap. He had become part of her life, her daughter's life, her fragile hope that the future might not be as bleak as the past. Still, she hesitated. She was a widow, a German. He was American. Their worlds did not fit together. The night before he left, he visited her apartment with a wooden toy, a small carved horse for her daughter. Helga held the toy gently, as if it might break. "I'll come back if I can," he said. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that matched the weight of the moment. But she managed only a quiet, trembling, "Be careful." James reached out, touched her hand, and left. No kiss, no promise, just a touch that lingered long after the door closed. For weeks, Helga did not hear from him. She told herself she should forget, that she should focus on survival. But the absence felt like an empty room in her heart, one she had never meant to furnish. One afternoon, as she returned from working on a rubble-clearing team, she found a letter on her doorstep. It was from James. He had written in imperfect German, every line careful, every mistake endearing. He asked if she would allow him to visit when he next had leave. He wrote that he thought of her often, that he missed seeing her daughter laugh. Helga read the letter 3 times, then sat down on the floor of her cold apartment and wept from relief, from fear, from the terrifying possibility of happiness. Ilse's secret love, and the weight of judgment. Ilse Brenner's relationship with Sergeant Daniel Harris had deepened despite the whispers around them. She no longer cared what neighbors thought. Daniel no longer cared about the risks. But society, both American and German, cared very much. One evening, Ilse visited the market, with Daniel walking a few steps behind her to avoid attracting too much attention. A group of older German women glared at her, hissing insults under their breath. Shameful. American lover. One of those girls. Ilse felt their eyes burning into her skin. She kept walking, but her hands trembled. Later that night, she confided in Daniel. "They think I'm betraying my country," she said. Daniel took her hand gently. "You're not betraying anyone. You're just trying to live. But living shouldn't feel like this," she whispered. He wanted to protect her from the judgment, but he couldn't protect her from her own doubts. Even love, perhaps especially love, felt dangerous in a place still wounded by war. By spring, Daniel asked her a question that changed everything. "Would you ever consider coming with me? To America?" Ilse froze. America felt like another planet. Her English was limited. Her family was here. Her entire life, even in ruins, was here. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could imagine it. A small house with a garden. A life far from the shadows of war. A future not defined by ruins. But she also feared the backlash. Marrying an American would mean stepping into a new world, while being judged by the one she left behind. Her answer came slowly. "I need time," she said. Daniel nodded. He understood. But the uncertainty gnawed at both of them. Maria's 2 sons. And the shame that wasn't hers. Maria Koenig carried a burden heavier than any physical labor she had ever done. She survived by making choices she never wanted to speak aloud. Her sons believed she was a hero, a woman who kept them alive when everything around them collapsed. But the world judged her differently. Women like Maria were whispered about harshly, accused of being immoral, accused of betraying their homeland, accused of selling themselves to Americans. But Maria knew the truth. She had saved her sons with the only resource she had left herself. In early 1946, she found work cleaning in a school that had reopened with broken windows and makeshift chalkboards. The principal, a stern but kind man, offered her a position because he saw the desperation in her eyes. Maria did everything to build a new life. She avoided American soldiers now. She avoided conversations about the past. She avoided the mirror when she could. One day, her eldest son brought home a leaflet distributed by the Americans about war brides and new visa policies. These leaflets were symbols of hope for many women. For Maria, they were reminders of what she had never wanted, what she had been forced into. Her son asked innocently, "Mama, why do some German women marry Americans?" Maria swallowed hard. "Because life takes people in different directions," she said. "And sometimes, survival makes choices for us." Her voice was steady, but her heart was raw. Maria's story was not about romance. It was not about betrayal. It was about the brutal cost of being a mother in a devastated world, a cost history rarely acknowledges. The American families who said no. As more relationships became serious, a new barrier emerged, one far more painful than the fraternization ban. American families. Many soldiers wrote to their parents about the German women they loved. Some received warm, cautious approval, but many received replies filled with anger and disbelief. "You cannot bring a German girl into this family. Have you forgotten what they did? She is only using you. This shame will ruin us." For many soldiers, these letters were devastating. They had fought through the war believing they were defending a better world, one that valued fairness, compassion, human dignity. Yet now, in the peace they had helped create, they were told they could not choose the person they loved simply because she was German. Some soldiers ended their relationships under this pressure. Some continued them in secret. Some fought their families with stubborn determination. Daniel Harris was one of those who fought. He wrote back to his parents, "She is not the Germany you imagine. She is a person, and she survived hell with more dignity than most people I know." But Daniel's parents remained unmoved. Their refusal hung over Ilse like a cloud. Even if she loved him enough to leave Germany, would she be welcomed in America? Or would she become an outsider there too? It was a question that haunted thousands of women. Bureaucracy. The invisible enemy. Even when families approved, another obstacle remained: the U.S. military bureaucracy. Marriage between soldiers and German women required extensive background checks, multiple approvals, character assessments, medical examinations, documentation proving neither party was morally questionable, and, in many cases, months of waiting. For women like Helga, Ilse, and thousands of others, the paperwork felt endless. A wall of signatures standing between two people trying to build a future amid ruins. Many couples never made it through the process. Some soldiers were transferred before approval came. Some lost hope. Some simply ran out of time. But the ones who persevered often did so because they believed they had stumbled upon something rare. Love born not from comfort, but from survival and shared humanity. The fragile weddings among the ruins. By late 1946 and into 1947, small weddings began appearing across the American zone. Some were held in churches missing half their windows. Some took place in municipal offices lit by candles. Some were celebrated with nothing more than a handshake and a marriage certificate. Brides wore borrowed dresses or simple skirts. Grooms wore uniforms instead of tuxedos. Guests brought gifts they had bartered or salvaged from the ruins: a loaf of bread, a tin of coffee, a knitted scarf. These weddings were quiet, but deeply emotional. They represented not only love, but escape. Escape from the ruins, from hunger, from judgment, from a past that had stolen too much. Afterward, the brides faced a final trial, leaving Germany. For those accepted to emigrate, the journey to America felt surreal. Boarding a ship or plane meant stepping away from everything familiar, stepping into a future built on fragile hope. Some wept the entire trip. Some stared toward the horizon in silence. Some held their new husbands' hands with a mixture of fear and determination. A nation searching for itself again. By 1947, Germany was no longer the silent, stunned landscape it had been in the first months after the surrender. Newspapers returned, though thin and full of cautious language. Shops reopened, their shelves sparsely lined but no longer empty. Children's voices could be heard in schoolyards restored from shattered foundations. Yet beneath this surface, the country struggled with an invisible battle. The moral reconstruction of a society shattered by defeat and haunted by guilt. Women bore much of that invisible burden. They were asked to rebuild homes, raise children, support aging parents, and navigate the complicated legacies of their husbands, some dead, some missing, some tainted by the past. And for those who had formed relationships with American soldiers, life grew more complicated still. The war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. Helga's second beginning. For months, Helga and Private James Walker exchanged letters, awkward, tender, hopeful. His German improved slowly. Her English improved faster out of necessity. Each letter carried warmth, humor, and the steady rhythm of two lives, learning how to speak across cultures. When James received permission to visit her again in early 1947, he traveled through a winter landscape still scarred by the war. Helga waited outside her small apartment building, snow settling on her coat. When she saw him, she felt something unfamiliar. Relief mixed with excitement. They spoke for hours. He brought small gifts, powdered milk, tea, wool socks for her daughter. But he also brought something deeper, the possibility of a future. Near the end of his visit, he asked her the question he had rehearsed countless times. Would you consider coming with me? To America? Only if you want to. Helga stood silent. She had spent years surviving day by day without dreams. Now, she was being offered one. She looked at her daughter playing with the wooden horse James had carved months earlier. The child was laughing something rare these days. Helga answered with a quiet strength. If we go together. All three of us. James nodded, eyes bright. From that day, they began the exhausting journey of paperwork, approvals, interviews, declarations, and waiting. But unlike many couples, they made it through every step. When Helga boarded the ship months later, she carried one suitcase, her daughter's hand, and a small envelope of letters tied with string. She left behind ruins literal and emotional, and stepped toward a life she did not yet understand. In America, she would become part of a small but resilient community of German war brides. She would face suspicion, curiosity, kindness, and the slow process of becoming someone new. But she would not face it alone. Ilse's choice. Ilse Brenner's story was different. Her relationship with Sergeant Daniel Harris deepened until it seemed inevitable that they would marry. But inevitability is not destiny. Daniel fought tirelessly for approval to bring Ilse to the United States. His parents resisted. The paperwork dragged. Transfers threatened to separate them. In the spring of 1947, Daniel arrived at Ilse's town with news. His posting in Germany was ending. He would be shipped home within weeks. They walked by the river at dusk, the water reflecting the pale light of a recovering city. Ilse felt pressure building inside her, a choice she had avoided too long. Daniel stopped and looked at her with quiet intensity. If you want to come with me, we'll find a way, he said. If you want to stay, I'll understand. Ilse imagined America. Wide streets, unfamiliar food, strangers' voices, judgment in new forms. She imagined her mother alone. She imagined never hearing German spoken around her again. She imagined a future she could not picture clearly. She turned to Daniel, and for a long moment, sadness and love existed together in her eyes. "I care for you more than I thought possible," she whispered. "But my life is here. My mother needs me. Germany needs me. I'm still rebuilding myself." Daniel nodded slowly, though heartbreak flickered behind his steady expression. They walked back in silence. At her door, he kissed her forehead, a gesture full of tenderness and quiet finality. Weeks later, he boarded a ship alone. Ilse stayed in Germany, carrying memories of a love that had appeared in the ruins and disappeared on the road to recovery. She would marry a German engineer in 1952, not out of passion, but out of companionship. Yet she would keep one photograph of Daniel in a small box in her desk for the rest of her life. Some loves do not last, but they leave light where there was once darkness. Maria's redemption. Maria Koenig spent years trying to rebuild her life, piece by piece. Her sons grew, their hunger less constant. Her work at the school brought her stability. But shame lingered like a shadow. She did not seek love. She did not seek a husband. She sought only peace. One day, in 1948, a letter arrived from the American Red Cross. It listed social programs for women and children affected by the occupation. Among the programs was a support network for single mothers who had endured the war's darkest circumstances. Maria attended one meeting hesitant, anxious but left transformed. The room was full of women like her. Women judged for things they had done to survive. Women who carried secrets. Women who blamed themselves for choices made under impossible circumstances. For the first time since the war, Maria felt understood. Over time, she became a quiet leader in the group. She helped other women find work, navigate ration systems, apply for financial assistance, learn new skills. She became a source of strength in a world that had taken almost everything from her. Her sons grew into kind, compassionate young men, shaped deeply by her silent sacrifices. They never knew the full extent of what she endured, but in adulthood, they honored her with the respect she had never given herself. Maria never married again. She never sought romance or forgiveness, but she found dignity. And sometimes, dignity is a greater victory than happiness. The War Bride Migration, a journey across the ocean. Between 1946 and 1950, more than 10,000 German women married American soldiers and emigrated to the United States. They boarded ships with suitcases packed from rubble-filled homes. Some carried children, some carried hope, all carried uncertainty. On these long voyages, women whispered stories to one another. Stories of forbidden meetings, of nights without heat, of soldiers who shared coffee and compassion, of families who resisted, of bureaucrats who approved or denied their futures. When they arrived in New York, Baltimore, or Boston, crowds watched them disembark, some curious, some skeptical, some hostile. But these women stepped onto American soil with quiet courage. They rebuilt their lives again from zero. Many learned English within months. Many became citizens. Many raised children who never fully understood the world their mothers had left behind. What they carried was invisible, but profound. The memory of a Germany that no longer existed. The women who stayed behind. Not every relationship ended in marriage or migration. Most German women stayed in their homeland. They rebuilt houses. They worked in factories once reopened. They became nurses, teachers, seamstresses, clerks, and business owners. Many never spoke openly about the Americans they knew, not because they were ashamed, but because the world preferred clean histories with sharp edges. Their lives had been lived in the gray areas between survival and affection. As West Germany rose from the ruins during the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950 seconds, these women became the backbone of the new society. Not celebrated, Not famous, but essential. They were the mothers of a generation who grew without bombs. They were the workers who built a stable democracy. They were the quiet healers of a wounded nation. Memory, silence, and the weight of history. In later decades, historians attempted to document the experiences of German women after the war, but many stories remained hidden. Some women did not want to relive trauma. Some did not want to reopen wounds. Some believed their experiences would be misunderstood or judged harshly. But their silence is not emptiness. It is depth. Behind every woman who lived through those years lies a novel that will never be written, a confession that will never be spoken aloud, a memory that survives only in the private corners of the heart. Their stories remind us that war is not only fought on battlefields. It is fought in kitchens without food, in homes without walls, in choices made in desperation, in the courage to rebuild after losing everything. The final reflection. When we look back at post-war Germany, we often see ruins, treaties, political shifts, and military strategies. But the true rebuilding was done by hands. Hands cracked from cold. Hands scraped by bricks. Hands that held children close. Hands that reached across forbidden lines to touch another human being. The women of 1945, 1950, lived in the shadow of a catastrophe they did not choose. Yet they became the architects of recovery. Some found love. Some found loss. Some found strength they did not know they had. Some crossed oceans. Some stayed rooted in their broken cities and rebuilt them brick by brick. Their stories are not about triumph or tragedy alone. They are about endurance, the quiet, steady kind that rebuilds nations, one life at a time. The final chapter of this story is not written in history books. It is written in families, in memories, in the silent courage carried through generations. After the war ended, these women began another battle, not for victory, but for life. And in their own ways, they won.